Okay, so what might we do to regain our strategic competence? The first is we have to think about these problem sets, these challenges, on their own terms. And I think there's been a tendency in recent years to be overly theoretical. And believe me, some of my best friends are political scientists, but I'm a historian, and I think that it is really important not to be able to conduct analysis without the burden of a theory, and to just think clearly about that problem and ask first-order questions, right? To frame problems before we jump right into it, which is really gets to this point, which is understanding those problems on their own terms. When I took over as National Security Advisor, I'd recognized from a historical perspective this tendency for us to get around the table and say, okay, well, what are we going to do about Iran? And everybody starts talking about, hey, what they're going to do about it. Well, let's understand the nature of the problem first. So we put into the National Security Council staff process a new meeting called a Principals Small Group Framing Session. And that session was just to apply design thinking to these challenges, understand those problems on their own terms, and to ask really some fundamental questions. What is the nature of this challenge? What are the vital interests that are at stake? View that challenge through the lens of those vital interests, craft an overarching goal, more specific objectives, and then a critical step is to understand really assumptions, especially assumptions concerning the degree to which we believe we have influence and agency over that problem set, we being the United States and like-minded partners. It's also important for us to maintain a strategic focus and not get down into tactical details. When I first got into the White House, I inventoried the restrictions that have been put in place on departments and agencies, mainly the Department of Defense. And there was really no good reason for a lot of these restrictions. And I think these were a manifestation, in large measure, of the absence of a strategy. And I could give you examples if you want to talk more about it. But the National Security Council staff was meeting very frequently, and they were mainly meeting over tactical decisions that ought to be taken in the departments and agencies. And the departments and agencies should be confident in making those decisions if there is a sound strategy in place. Long-term versus short-term. We tend to focus really on the immediate, and we don't carve out really the time to think long-term. We restructured the National Security Council staff with a new Deputy National Security Advisor for strategy. And it was her job just to think long-term, to work with policy planning in the State Department and OSD policy in defense and with our intelligence agencies to really ensure that we weren't getting into just tactical details and short-termism. Collaboration is immensely important for the fundamental reason is because none of these problems are easy. They're very complex, and they require an interdisciplinary perspective. And there's a tendency at times, especially if it's sensitive planning, to try to close off that group into a very small group of people. If you think about the decisions that led up to the Iraq War, part of the problem in the Defense Department, for example, in terms of the lack of a plan for, okay, what happens next, was that planning group was shrunk down to a very small group. And that group wasn't sufficient to bring to bear an interdisciplinary perspective that might have highlighted the significant difficulties we encountered in Iraq in connection with the consolidation of gains and to get to a sustainable political outcome. Okay, so what I have seen are strategies oftentimes, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, we could talk more about that if you'd like, that rest on fundamentally flawed assumptions. But those assumptions go unchallenged because they're implicit. It's very important for any policy or strategy, if you're going to make an assumption, to make it explicit so it can be continuously challenged. And if the conditions reveal what your assumption's wrong, then hey, it's time to go back to the drawing board. And then finally, strategic competence has a lot to do with integrating all elements of national and international power and efforts of like-minded partners. There's been a tendency for us to think, hey, well, what we do is we do diplomacy, for example, up to a certain point, and then if diplomacy fails, hey, then we turn it over to the military. What is important for strategic competence is to integrate what we're doing diplomatically with what we're doing militarily, with what we're doing financially and economically and informationally, and from a law enforcement perspective and an intelligence perspective. I mean, where you've seen this really happen in the most egregious way is in Afghanistan, where we have, across the last two administrations, disconnected what we're doing militarily from what we're trying to achieve politically in connection with these most recent negotiations with the Taliban, which I think are terrible. Okay, and then flexible. Any strategy has to have a degree of flexibility in execution and implementation. The future course of events, again, depends not on what we decide to do, but it depends on actions of the other, right? Think about the assumptions that underpin the previous decisions in Afghanistan, for example, to announce in 2009 the reinforcement of the military effort there with additional troops, and at the same time announce the timeline for withdrawal of those troops. As if the enemy is going to adhere to the script that we lay out for them to follow. And then so as we improve our strategic competence, we also have to recognize that we have to have strategic confidence. Confidence in who we are as a people. Confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. And I think as we have experienced this shift from over-optimism to pessimism or resignation, I think we have seen a degradation in our confidence in who we are internally, and also in our confidence in our ability to execute an effective foreign policy and national security strategy. So how do we see that manifest today? We see a lack of confidence in our forever war narrative. There's, I think, an op-ed in the New York Times today, which is from their editorial board, which is indicative of this thinking. End these wars. Well, hey, guess what? The wars don't end when you leave, right? I mean, we learned that in 2011. As the English, the theologian and philosopher, author G.K. Chesterton said, he said, wars may not be the best way of settling differences, but they're the only way to ensure they're not settled for you. If you think about how this war-weary narrative, we're war-weary when the percentage of the population serving in our military and active duty is the lowest in the modern era. Of our active duty forces, only 15% are stationed abroad. That is the lowest number since 1950, but we're tired. We also think it's overly expensive to have troops positioned overseas, right, to maintain engaged from a military perspective, but it's actually much cheaper to keep forces positioned overseas because of the cost sharing of our allies. And then, of course, I think we know it's easier to prevent wars than to have to respond to a crisis. In 1948, the Secretary of Defense was visiting South Korea, and he came back and he said, these troops, they're kind of bored over there. I mean, there's really their parents are missing them. Just get them off the Korean Peninsula and get them back to the United States. And then, of course, we know what happened in June of 1950. We also know what happened when ISIS took over large swaths of Iraqi territory and Iraq's second largest city of Mosul, and the effort that was required to respond to that as well.